Anatomy and physiology of the eye. It is so important for the iridologist to understand the anatomy and physiology of the eye and how the eye connects with the brain and the body. By learning the anatomy and physiology of the eye, the iridologist can understand where the pigment of the eye is located, what the fibers of the iris are made up of, how the pupil connects to the spinal cord, and how the collarette is involved with the autonomic nervous system and digestion. We can discern the difference between the iris, the cornea, and the sclera, and better understand the signs concerning health that we can see in those areas. Let's learn the fascinating parts of the eye and how they work. It is very important for the iridologist to understand the anatomy and physiology of the eye. The iris itself, which we see here in this picture, is in blue, and it is about the size of a dime. It is made up of blood vessels, connective tissue, nerves, and muscles. There are 28,000 nerve endings that go into the iris from all parts of the body. In the back of the iris is the optic nerve. And this optic nerve is a bundle of over 1 million nerves that connect to the brain and spinal cord and then out to all organs of the body. In the center of the iris, right in the middle of the iris, is the pupil. And the pupil is a black hole that lets in light to help us see. Behind the pupil is the lens, and that's that clear, glassy looking area there. The lens is very important to help us see, and when it becomes hardened, that is the area where a person will get a cataract. Outside the iris is the sclera, and that's outside in this area here, and that's the white part of your eye that you can see when you look in the mirror. And the sclera is made up of lots of blood vessels, which we're going to learn to read some of the signs for later as we go on in this lesson. Between and on top of the iris here is the cornea, which looks like a glass dome. And that's going to be important for you in your lessons later on. So remember cornea on top of the iris. Between the cornea and the iris, right in this area, is the aqueous humor, which lubricates the eye. And back here, between the lens and the optic nerve in this area, we have the vitreous humor, which holds the eye in place. The ciliary muscles here are the area that hold the lens in place. So those are the most important areas for the anatomy and physiology of the eye that you need to remember. The conjunctiva is a thin film that lies on top of the sclera, where a lot of the vessels are shown that you'll be learning later on. In the corner of the eye is the canthus, and we can see the canthus here right beside the nose. And it's just important to remember that that's called the canthus because we often use that term so that we know where we're at when talking about the iris. On the outer edge of the eye is the outer or lateral canthus, and then near the nose is the medial canthus. And as we discussed before, in the center of the iris is the pupil. And outside the iris is the sclera. And then we have what we call the collarette, which goes completely around the iris there. And we'll be discussing that more as we go on as well. The lacrimal ducts and sac are very important to remember because that's where the tears actually flow from, and that's why sometimes when you cry you'll have water coming down through your nose. Now we want to discuss the eye-brain nerve connection. It is very important for us to learn that the eyes are intricately connected to the brain and then the spinal cord, and all parts of the body. The left iris is intricately connected to the right brain hemisphere. So here we see how the left iris goes to the right brain hemisphere, and then it crosses again here and comes down and connects to the left side of the body. The right iris here actually connects to the left brain hemisphere, which then crosses again and connects to the right side of the body. So when we work with the left iris, we're mostly seeing signs from the left side of the body out here. When we work with the right iris, we're mostly seeing signs from the right side of the body. Now we're going to discuss various layers of the iris. Let's look at the cornea. The cornea is just on top of the iris and looks like a glass dome. This is important for the iridologist to remember because lipids and fat can fill into that cornea later in a person's life. Underneath the cornea, we actually have the iris. And the iris is the colored part of the eye that you see. And behind the iris is the posterior membrane. And that membrane rolls up around the pupil, and when the pupil opens really wide, it causes rivets in the iris, which are like ditches, or it can cause the iris to be more wavy. So we have several layers of the eye that are important. The actual iris is made up of fibers, many different iris fibers, and the whole area is called the stroma, those iris fibers. And underneath those fibers is the posterior membrane, or the posterior epithelium. Here we have a cross-section of the iris, and this is very important as well to see the different layers of the eye. On the very top layer of the iris is the anterior endothelium. And we don't really have that listed here because it's not that important to the iridologist because it's an invisible layer of flattened cells. The anterior border layer is actually right on top of the iris, and that's the area where the pigment is located. In the blue iris, such as in this eye, it lacks pigment. In a dark brown iris, there's more pigment. Lots of pigment in the anterior border layer. That is exactly the layer where we see the color of the iris of the eye. And then we have the collarette, also called the autonomic nerve wreath, that is about 1/3 of the way out from the pupil, unless it's in a different area in some people. And that collarette shows us sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve energy. Right around the pupil is the pupillary border, and that border, try to remember that that border is controlled by the back of the eye. And the back of the eye rolls up around the pupil. The back of the eye, which is the dilator muscle and the posterior epithelium, is black. And that's why your pupil is black. And it rolls up around the pupil. It's a dilator muscle and is run by the sympathetic nervous system. So when you're in shock, it opens the pupil wider. The sphincter muscle is located right here, and that sphincter muscle is a round donut that actually encircles the pupil. It goes around like this, around the pupil. And that sphincter muscle is what contracts the pupil when there's too much light. And the sphincter muscle is run by the parasympathetic nervous system. Now over here, we see different layers of iris fiber. Right on top of the iris layers, the fibers will be more white. They'll be raised white fibers, such as in this area. And those raised white fibers actually show us irritation, inflammation. These are all tendencies. Remember, these are genetic potential to the health of the body. And then we have a layer that's a little bit lower than those white fibers, and that's the light gray area. And those light gray areas are genetic areas where we see a little bit less energy, less potential. They cannot hold nutrients in as well or kick toxins out as well. The dark gray fibers are even deeper within the iris of the eye, and those dark gray fibers show generations of lack of energy. And then we have in the very lowest layers the black, very black fibers. Now remember, we want you to understand that those very black areas are black because the fibers have separated to that very low layer, which is the posterior epithelium, which is made up of black pigment cells. But because they're so deeply separated, they're showing us generations of deficiency in that organ reaction field that can eventually cause a possible weakness to that person's body. And finally, we see here something called a contraction furrow. And that is like a groove or a ditch in the iris of the eye. The deeper that groove, the blacker it will be because of this posterior black epithelium. Those grooves or ditches are called contraction furrows, and they will look deeper as the pupil opens wider. So as a person is in shock or the pupil is very huge, those contraction furrows will be much deeper. And those are what we see as a tendency for anxiety and stress in that person. We also see that collarette. Here we've talked about the collarette, which is the autonomic nerve wreath made up of sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve energy. It's the small arterial circle, while the iris edge is the large arterial circle. And that collarette shows us about the nerve energy of that person, as well as a lot about their digestion, which we will learn later on. So here we have a review of the various layers front to back and the pupillary border. So the anterior endothelium we discussed was at the very top of the iris, and this is a layer that's very flat and it's not seen with the naked eye. The anterior border layer is very important for the iridologist to remember because that's the layer where the pigment's located that gives the iris its color. So if you see a brown eye, it's because the anterior border layer has brown pigment within it. If you see a blue eye, it's because of a lack of pigment in that anterior border layer. Below the pigment is the stroma, and this is the bulk of the iris, which is made up of blood vessels that are also called iris fibers or a trabecula. Each iris fiber is called a trabecula. More than one trabecula has an E on the end. Each iris fiber is a blood vessel, and that blood vessel is wrapped in a sheath. That is the structure of the iris or the stroma, which is beneath the pigmentation. The back of the stroma is the posterior membrane, which is a muscle called the dilator muscle. And it is responsible for the dilation of the pupil in darkness. And that dilator muscle is moved by sympathetic nerve energy. Remember, sympathetic nerve energy means fight or flight. So if a person is in shock, it's going to become very huge. It's going to open the pupil very large. And the very back of that posterior membrane is the posterior epithelium, which is very black. And that rolls up around the pupil. So the posterior membrane and the posterior epithelium work together, and they move up around the pupil to enlarge the pupil. They are called the dilator muscle. The pupillary ruff, and that pupillary ruff outlines the pupil. It's the inner edge of the posterior epithelial layer. So that back of the iris, that posterior epithelial layer, that black epithelial layer, curls toward the anterior or the front of the iris and goes around the pupil, encircling the margin of the pupil. It's called the pupillary ruff. It's also called the pupillary border. But that is why it's black, because the back of the iris is black, and that rolls up around the pupil to help the pupil dilate. Here we see a nice iris that gives us a wonderful example of the border of the pupil. So the border of the pupil we can see here is black. And there's a fringe all the way around that pupil, which is black. And that's an extension of the dilator muscle, which comes up from the back of the iris. And right around the pupil is a donut-shaped muscle called the sphincter muscle. And that sphincter muscle is round, and it's below the iris fibers. And it shows up when the iris fibers are thin. So in a stronger iris, we will not see that sphincter muscle showing through. So when we see the sphincter muscle, that's showing us that there's a deficiency in zone number 1, the zone of the stomach and the zone of digestion. The next area we want to discuss is the pupillary or the nutritive zone, which is between zone number 1 and zone number 2. So between zone number 1 and zone number 2, in this area, we see the nutritive zone. Zone number 1 is the stomach zone, which here we see the sphincter muscle showing through. Zone number 2 is in this area, and that's the intestinal tract. Zone number 1 and 2 is the nutritive zone. 1 and 2, digestion and absorption, make up the nutritive zone or the pupillary zone. That's that area there. The ciliary zone is out here. The ciliary zone is outside the nutritive zone, and right around the nutritive zone is the collarette. The collarette goes around the nutritive zone, and in this eye, it's a bit wavy, and the collarette goes around the nutritive zone, and it shows us the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve energy. Here's another edge of the collarette. So everything outside the collarette is the ciliary zone. Everything inside the collarette, from the pupil border to the edge of the collarette, is the nutritive zone. So these are areas that we need to remember when we're learning to analyze the iris of the eye. The anatomy of the iris shows us the layers in this picture. Here we see on top of the iris, in the anterior border layer, the brown pigmentation. That's where the brown pigment is located, on top of the iris fibers in the anterior border layer. In a blue iris, we have less pigment on top of the iris fibers, and then underneath the pigment we have the stroma, which is made of blood vessels. And each iris fiber is a blood vessel wrapped in a sheath. and that entire area is called the stroma. Each blood vessel, as we have noted before, is called a trabecula. In back of the stroma is the posterior membrane, which is a muscle. And in back of that muscle is the posterior epithelium that actually rolls up around the pupil to dilate the pupil and let in more light. Here we review the shading from light to dark. Shading is an important term in iridology because we can see fibers all the way from raised white fibers here to very black fibers here. Raised white fibers show us that there is a tendency for inflammation, irritation in that area, possibly pain. So when we see a raised white fiber in the iris of the eye, we want to ask the person, do you have any discharge? If it's in the nasal area, do you have sinus congestion, discharge? The iris gives us the questions to ask. If we see a raised white fiber in the lower back, for example, in the lower back reaction field, we would ask if they have aching or pain in that area. So as the fibers separate into the different layers, we have here the first layer, which is light gray. So that is going to be less reactive. It will not be able to kick toxins out as well or hold nutrients in as well. The dark gray areas are going to be even less reactive, and the black areas come from long generations of deterioration of the iris fibers genetically. So those very black areas, when we see those very black areas where the fibers have separated all the way to the posterior epithelium, those areas are long-standing genetic deficiencies in that person, and many times they're not bothering that person in the moment. But the iris shows us genetic potential. So if we see that area in a child, for example, in the kidney reaction field, we would like to talk with the parents about nourishing that area with good foods for the kidney to help prevent problems from occurring later in life. So in summary, we have white or light iris fibers, and those white or light iris fibers were formerly called acute signs. They are raised and signify potential agitation, irritation, inflammation, possible pain or discharge to the organs represented by the reaction fields of the iris that these signs are in. The light gray signs that I just showed you, formerly for some students they may have learned subacute signs. These are slightly lower than the stromal surface and indicate a tendency for sluggishness and a lowered ability to ward off illness in the organs represented by the iris fields therein. Dark gray fibers, formerly called chronic signs, that are deeper than the light gray fibers show potential deficiency, lack of ability to hold in nutrients, and throw off toxicity. Very black fibers in the iris were formerly called degenerative signs. We no longer call them degenerative signs or chronic signs because they sound so very negative. We now call them black fibers because they actually are black fibers that are showing up through the lacuna or the openings in the iris. Black fiber areas in the iris show the greatest genetic weakness or insufficiency in those areas that they represent in the body. These organs may not cause difficulty until very much later in life. They are measures of prevention and should be considered particularly if there has been much physical abuse, as they are believed to be predictors of serious illness. And now I'd like to teach you the term perifocal lightening. When we see a white or light raised fiber around a very deep, dark lacuna or dark area of the iris where the fibers have separated, it indicates deficiency and inability of that organ represented to hold nutrients in and carry toxins off, and a potential for extreme inflammation in that area.